Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here. I said I felt a bit like the dust cart after the Lord Mayor's Ball. So you've had the Lord Mayor's Ball, and now it's the dust cart. But it's great to be here. I must congratulate the catchment group, because I think catchments are the best example of collaboration, research and progress in farming in New Zealand. It's wonderful to see communities get together in these things, so that's great. So compliments to you all. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the areas we're interested in at the university. And in the last few years, Otago University has started an initiative which started as a research called Agri-Otago, and now it's a teaching program called Agriculture Innovation. And basically these are our high-flown statements. This is what we hope to achieve. We hope to turn challenges into opportunities. Having worked in the farming sector for 50 years nearly, I think probably the most important role we can play as academics is the role of advocacy, where we can stand between regulators and producers and sometimes negotiate positions which are maybe slightly different than the originals. And we're now dealing obviously with an eco-sensitive marketplace, so what we did before is not necessarily acceptable for what we do in the future. So what we want to do is look and see how we move forward. We think at a fundamental level, probably the bottom line is all about, and that is we're now looking at not just the nutrition of food, but also the medicinal values of food, and we hopefully can incorporate some of that. Okay, so we've basically got three areas we're interested in. The first area is science, and we call that agri-tech. The second area is food and adding value in the food chain, and that's called agribusiness. And the third one is agriculture in the environment. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today, agriculture and the environment. And we say what we want to look at is sustainable, profitable environmental management with profit. Profit being very important because that's really where we see the thing leading. And that's underpinned obviously by certain disciplines. In agri-tech we have obviously genetics, microbiology, chemistry, all those sort of things. Agribusiness we have a food science department. And then obviously when it comes to sustainable environmental studies, we have obviously a whole range of things. Now, if we look at the history of agriculture, and I'll just go back and say, how do we arrive at where we are today? Well, we arrived largely on the back of this guy, Borlaug, who back in the 1940s decided there had to be a different way to produce food. And he basically was a crop scientist, and he decided what we needed was superior strains of food-producing plants. So he looked at wheat, and he chose two characteristics of wheat plants. One, plants that were resistant to rust, and secondly, plants that were shorter, so dwarf plants. The dwarf plants were good because they didn't lodge when you had inclement weather. The rust ones obviously didn't have rust, and you had these disease-resistant plants. And based on that, we built a whole new model of agriculture. And that consisted of a whole bunch of things. It consisted of new strains of plants which were grown in monoculture. We then brought irrigation on the scene. We then had extensive mechanization. Then we have extensive development of agrochemicals. Nant has talked about some of obviously the fertilizer ones. And then we in fact look at other things that happened. We got smart, we cleared more land, so we had deforestation. And if we look at little New Zealand here, you can see in the middle, New Zealand, what would we do? We drained the wetlands. Now I've lost the wetlands somewhere along the way. No, they're there. And you can see what New Zealand looked like in terms of wetlands over 100 years ago. It had a significant amount of wetlands in blue, and you can see we got rid of most of those. So what implications does that have for our future in agriculture? Well, my claim is that if, with all the challenges facing you guys today, if we look at the knowledge we now have and the technologies we have available, we can work through these challenges systematically, and New Zealand farming can be a world leader and continue to be a world leader. So new technologies, I believe, and alternative land use or modified land use can get us to where I think we need to get to. If we look first of all at, I can't see very much from here, but obviously if we look here, my suggestion would be that instead of our historical approach, which obviously was built around monocultures, we should consider diverse cultures in our pastures. And we grow these pastures obviously differently than our classic short pastures of ryegrass and clover. So these here are tall pastures. So there is a prospect that we can increase the diversity of the food source we use. And now we have a different grazing pattern. Obviously, if you look at New Zealand farms, they tend to look like golf courses with nice short grass on them. I'm suggesting that by diversifying the range of plants we use in our cultures, we can create new opportunities. And the reason for that is that when we grow this new biomass, we don't have to consume it all and graze it right back down to low levels. We can in fact graze a component of it and leave some behind. And this is the principle used in regenerative agriculture. And there's a logic in that, because if we in fact graze the top part of the plants, we leave behind an intact root system, so you have recovery of the plant quite effectively. If you graze more than 50% of the leaf matter, well then in fact you've lost your photosynthetic platform and your recovery is slower. So by leaving biologic material behind, as is the principle of regenerative approaches, we can in fact, we believe, maximize the productive biomass at ground level. We also will put biomass back into the soil, and we believe that's vitally important, because obviously that's how we build topsoil. The way we manage that pasture is vitally important, and obviously the model used to manage this is mass grazing, where we use a large number of animals for a very short period of time. They graze the top third, they tread the rest of it into the ground, so we have essentially a huge biomass, almost half of the biomass left behind. It's trampled into the ground, they poo all over it and pee all over it, and in this kind of pasture system, you never see urine patches. They don't exist, because obviously it all gets hidden in this biomass underneath. So we believe that selective grazing is an adjunct to producing those sort of pastures. Now, we've got plants. Underneath those plants we have soil, and this to me is the whole start and end of the story. Everything starts and ends with soil, and the whole survival of our planet, the climatic systems and the rest, are all built around healthy soil. We have succeeded in losing 1/3 of the world's topsoil in the last 150 years. That's a lot of topsoil, and it's now out in the sea. We have to, I believe, consider reconstituting that. And if you take an orange and take the zest off it and put it in your fridge, you'll find inside 3 days it's completely dehydrated. So we have essentially exfoliated the planet. We've aridified large areas of the planet which are nothing on a desert now, and they can't reconstitute themselves. They can't contribute to a balanced global environment as bare earth. We need all the earth covered with living biomass. And when we have living biomass, we will have healthy soil. And those healthy soils can grow mixtures of plants, and then we start to see some very interesting options developing. Here we have a range of plants, all of which have roots that go to different depths in the soil. And if we look here, we have perennial ryegrass, here we have a clover. These are obviously typical plants we see in a lot of pastures in New Zealand, but we've got a whole lot of other plants as well, all of which produce root masses to go to totally different levels. And this is vitally important in a balanced, healthy ecosystem. We must have a range of plants, all of which essentially sample different components of the soil. We have these guys here who sample the top part, and that's maybe up to 30 centimeters. And then we go right down to meters here, where we find some of the deep-rooted plants here, like lucerne, we'll have taproots that go way down. And then we are now manifesting the full characteristics of the soil. Up top, in the topsoil, we have fertility, which allows us to grow successful pastures. So this contributes to the fertility of soil. And this explains why most soils in New Zealand are rich in carbon, because New Zealand produces a large biomass of material, that some of that goes back down into the ground and we build topsoil. So we're building soil from the top. So it is not unexpected that most soils in New Zealand will have high carbon, around 6%, and that's relatively consistent all over New Zealand. The really important issues are what happens down below. Because down below we have a dynamic system which obviously produces new soil. Down at the base level, at the rocks, we're obviously taking, some of these plants will be mining the minerals from the rocks, but also they do another important thing, and that is they transfer biological material from the surface layers of the soil down into the deeper layers of the soil. And down here, the deep roots may extract minerals, but also they're vitally important in storing stable carbon. And that is a very important principle if we're talking about climate and soil, because it's essential. We heard a lovely story about microorganisms and photosynthesis from ant, and here now we're seeing the full manifestation of soil. Up top we have obviously a layer of topsoil which is fertile and will feed any plant that wants to grow in it. And then down deeper we have areas which will either store carbon or mineralize their carbon and combine it with minerals from the basic rocks. So if we're to look at a healthy soil, then in fact we need plants that root at different levels, and that gives us the full potential of that soil to be productive and to be fertile. The other thing is, oh shit, wasn't meant to do that. Okay. Now if we want to look at a plant, we'll share another story even more exciting than Ant's story about the human microbiome, and this is the plant microbiome. Because everything has got a microbiome. The soil has a microbiome, and there are more organisms in the soil, as we heard, than there are on your body. So we have really an amazingly rich living mass down there, which is soil. In that we have plants. And those plants are magic because every part of that plant has microorganisms on it. And when you buy a seed from a healthy factory that produces seeds, it should also contain its own natural microflora on the seed. And that will be propagated with the plant, so then the plant grows up with a range of organisms which range from the soil here, which will have all kinds of microorganisms down the bottom. It will also have a whole series of fungi, and this creates what we call the rhizosphere. And the rhizosphere is vitally important because that allows us to store carbon, to produce carbon, to metabolize carbon, but most of all, the rhizosphere of the plants exchange nutrients and create a completely fertile milieu in which everything grows. So one plant will produce mycorrhiza all around it, and you'll see what a mycorrhiza looks like. In the center of the photograph on the left, we have the roots of a plant, and then out from that we have this mass array of fungal elements which are hugely important in collecting and storing nutrients and transferring those through the soil. And the largest organism in the world is a mycorrhiza. They claim it weighs about 430,000 tons. And it starts in Iowa, and I don't know where it ends, but it goes a long way. So here we have this incredible mass of organisms which are hugely important in sustaining the fertility of the soil, but they're also important in another really important characteristic, which is storing carbon. Because here we look, if you look at the left essentially on the top of that picture is the root of a plant, and associated with that are the mycorrhizae and the soluble carbon that's been fixed from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water, it puts them together, forms a sugar. That sugar is then secreted through the roots of the plant. And that becomes the nutrient for all the microorganisms which grow in the soil. So a healthy soil will have plants growing on it which are covered in microorganisms. It will have within the soil different layers of microorganisms, all of which contribute to the fertility and sustainability of that soil. And some people, in fact, just dig out soil and bring the soil to another place because they want to eventually capture those mycorrhizae. If you create a sterile environment in the soil, nothing will grow, and its fertility will be highly impaired. So here we have the answer to collecting atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis, transferring it into the soil through mycorrhizae, and then using deep-rooted plants to inject that carbohydrate deep into the soil where it can be stored as stable carbon. So that's really where I'm trying to head to. If we talk about climate change, we should be considering carbon as a critically important component of climate change, as well as fertility of soils and all the other things. And here, this brings me to a model for exploiting this, which we call regenerative. Now, I'm not sold totally on regenerative. I don't care whether you call it biological or polyculture or whatever you want to call it. It's growing plants and growing mixtures of plants to exploit these characteristics. And you can see here we have a regenerative model, and that can obviously give us opportunities to look at soil. Now here we have an example of two kinds of soils. On the left we have a soil which came from a regenerative organic model, and soil on the right which was treated with standard conventional fertilizers. And you can see, if you look at those soils, the one on the right-hand side, which we conventionally managed, up top it has a dark brown carbon-rich area, which is the topsoil. So that would be highly rich in carbon, and that grows, as I said, on most soils will be like that. And then on the left we have a different structure. On the left we have regenerated soil, and you can see it's darker in colour, so it has more organic matter now spread right throughout it. So over a course of 10 years, it's transferred the carbon from the top layer down to the bottom layers. And that's now injecting carbon and fertility deep into the soil. And that obviously would be desirable. It's also much more porous. So now we have soil which will absorb more moisture, it will retain more moisture, it will filter more than a conventional soil. And if we look at on the right-hand side, you will see largely we have a little bit of topsoil up top, and then we have a large clay layer which has much less carbon and will have much lower fertility. So we can create soil deep by having these farming approaches. Now the other thing that's interesting about this kind of model is we've got the same soils again. If we now look at the carbon content of different layers of those soils, and what you will see is the one on the left, the regenerative one, has topsoil at about the same level as the one on the right. So the topsoils are the same. If you then go down to the 20 to 40 millimeter layer, now what you see is there's twice as much carbon on the left as there is on the right. And the further you go down the soil, the more difference you get between the carbon content of the two soils. Now, so we're talking about the relative concentration of both. And what we're saying basically here is that we're not saying that there is more soil, there's more carbon on the bottom. We're saying in that bottom layer, there's 4 times more carbon than the other one, right? So we're talking about essentially injecting deep-seated fertility into the soil, which we think can be associated with climate as well as a whole bunch of soil characteristics. So if we look at that model of producing soil, and then we analyze what impact does it have on productive systems, here we're looking at an example of a regenerative approach to farming, where these guys have essentially grown meat, and they've done a full analysis of the carbon footprint of producing meat. And basically what you've got here is, we start out on the left-hand side, and what they've done is estimated the carbon footprint of producing a kilogram of hamburger meat. And what you've got on the, first of all, if you take all the emissions coming from the animals, we've got obviously enteric emissions where they burp, we've got manure, then we look at soil carbon uptake, we look at uptake in the vegetation, and then we look at all the ways carbon is partitioned in that production system, and what do you see? You see that you can produce a kilogram of meat under those conditions, and you can store 3.5 kilograms of carbon. So when somebody says to you, producing meat or having mindful Mondays is smart, tell them to think again. Because here we can create a system where, using the right management models, we can store more carbon in the soil than essentially is lost through the process of animals belching, burping, doing all the things they do. So this way here is an example of how we can produce meat with a positive rather than a negative carbon footprint. So using this, that's using mixed cultures and regenerative principles, that's what they can achieve. If we then look at all the blame against red meat and compare it to other meats, what do we see here? We see we again got the example of the meat up top, the red meat produced by regenerative, and then look at conventional beef. It has it essentially requires 33 kgs of carbon. So it's creating obviously a huge carbon footprint. And if we look at the different kind of foods, if we look at beef, if we look at pork, you can see all of those essentially require excess carbon. And I'll now just finish quite quickly by saying to you, what should we be focusing on in agriculture? I believe we should be focusing on soil and soil carbon, because soil carbon essentially No, I must explain this. Talking about the regenerative approach, there obviously is a suggestion in sort of conventional farming that it's not going to work and it's not relevant. Here you can see what's happening globally in the regenerative arena. First of all, General Mills have just supported the development of 1 million acres of land through regenerative principles. The known now are targeting foods which are produced regeneratively. The real interesting one is Merino, New Zealand. Imagine Merino, New Zealand requiring that you produce your wool by regenerative principles or maximal welfare principles. And when I asked them why did they do that, they said because that's what our customers want. People who wear merino wool wanted to have been produced in this biologically sensitive way. So the success is all built around carbon. And if we look, and just closing, what I want to talk about is climate and carbon. Because we've just had an announcement of a future way forward in climate management. And if we in fact look, we won't worry about that. We have an issue in New Zealand in the carbon debate, and this is something I would just like to share with you in closing. And that is, if we look at the debate in New Zealand about climate change, it's been entirely based on the principle of emission trading. I suggest that emission trading alone as a parameter to control climate and carbon is deficient on its own. Emission trading concentrates entirely on the emission or the cost of the carbon footprint. If we're going to have the cost of a carbon footprint, we must have the benefit of carbon credits. So we have to be able to measure how much is lost and how much is gained. And obviously what we do is, in a trading scheme, we pay for net emitters and we get credits if we're net beneficiaries. So I think if we're going to develop policy in New Zealand around climate change and carbon, it's vitally important we get our details right. Because I would suggest to you at present that the figures we have for measuring carbon, methane, carbon dioxide, or whatever else, they're thrown around as if they're absolute figures, but in fact there can be huge potential for error in many of the figures we talk about, these parameters. And I would suggest to you that in fact we need to look very carefully at what we talk about when we talk about methane. Animals are basically given a real bad rap for methane. But if we look at the comparison between methane coming from industry and various other sources, rice or whatever else produces, or termites, we see that in fact when we audit for animal emissions of things, it's a life cycle analysis. We measure every bit of methane that's involved everywhere in the cycle. When we talk about industrial methane, all we talk about is what happens from the moment the bus leaves the station, not how much it costs to produce all the components of that. And the estimates are that even in synthetic fertilizer production, there can be a 200-fold difference between what the industry claims to be their methane emissions and the reality of methane emissions against those industries. So we've got to be very careful that the figures we use to make claims for policy and regulations are based solidly in fact. And I think we need to consider all that before we start to think about committing hara-kiri to try and fulfill the requirements of new climate change regulations. I am really excited about what New Zealand can do. I believe that in the next 20 years, we can become a carbon neutral society, one of the few farming societies left on the planet. And I believe if we can wrap around a zero carbon label around the food we produce, that's going to have a huge incentive. And obviously at this stage, the only thing you've got to ensure if your farmers are that you have more people than cows, because that seems to be the only equation that people look at. So I think there's an exciting future for meats. I think we can create management models to produce meat which will be carbon negative or carbon neutral. And there's a huge future ahead to mark New Zealand as the world's leading country in ecological management, pest management, and negative carbon status. So it's really exciting. All I would suggest is that we don't project too much of the carbon neutral milk or carbon zero milk. Because if we're going to make claims for something, we've got to be absolutely sure that what our claim is going to be sustainable and accurate, right? So I don't think we need to overclaim, because if we're going to replace milk with forests, well, maybe Fonterra will turn from being a dairy company into a forest. And I don't think that's what we're really trying to achieve. So I think we have to create models which create genuine zero states. And when we do that, we can then go to the world and make claims about the health and welfare of our animals, which will mean our food products will be valued in perpetuity. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I feel like such a bad person.